All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Director of Research and Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'll be chairing our session today on the Zimbabwe elections. This event is being hosted by our good friends and partners at the Center for African Studies at Howard University, and we thank them for having us on today, and I'm very glad to be helping out and sharing this discussion with you all today. We are here to discuss, as I mentioned, the impacts on U.S. foreign policy of the recent elections in Zimbabwe. We're going to be covering a number of different topics, mainly three things: the different positions of regional and international actors on the elections themselves, debates regarding sanctions in Zimbabwe, and debates surrounding lithium mining. And we have a fantastic and very full panel of experts to discuss all of these topics with us. I'm going to briefly introduce them all now, and then a more full bio will be pasted into the chat when it's each person's turn to speak. We are still waiting for one speaker to arrive, and that is Ibbo Mandaza of SAPES Trust. We'll fit him in after he arrives. So then we'll be starting off with Ringisai Chikohomero of ISS Africa. We'll then be moving to McDonald Lewanika of the Accountability Lab. Following McDonald, we'll have Gilbert Khadiagala from the University of Witwatersrand and the Center for the African Center for the Study of the United States in South Africa. Next, we will have Ambassador Charlie Ray, who is chair of the Africa program at FPRI. And finally, we'll have Michael Walsh, who is an affiliate of the Center for African Studies at Howard and also a senior fellow with us at FPRI. How this is going to go is I'm going to give each speaker a very brief amount of time to issue some opening remarks here, three to 5 minutes at most. And then we will open things up for questions and answers from the audience. Please feel free to post a question into the Q&A box or the chat at any time, and then we'll get to as many of them as we can as we approach the question and answer session. So with all that out of the way, I'm going to hand things over to Ringisai.
Thanks, Jeff. And hello to everyone. It's my pleasure to be part of this panel to discuss this topic. I think my opening submissions are to say, I think we're at a point where the United States needs to have a candid evaluation of its policy, foreign policy towards Zimbabwe, a candid evaluation of the relations and its position in terms of the re-engagement. I think the main thing for me and for us at the IAS has always been to try and understand that at this point it's difficult to divorce Zimbabwe from a region and the continent. So the foreign policy towards Zimbabwe has to be framed within this understanding of what is the ultimate goal to be achieved within the continent and within the region. What we have seen in the last 23 years is some sentiments of Zimbabwean exceptionalism that have led to invariably Zimbabwe building more alliances within its neighbors and within the region, and then forming a bulwark against the United States policies that are actually in one way intended to nudge or to motivate for behavior change towards good governance, alignment with global practices in terms of elections, democracy, and economic policies and individual rights. In most instances, we've had a bit of the negative in terms of the intended effects and impact. But from where I sit, I think we have an opportunity to have a candid evaluation to try and look at how do you repurpose and reposition the thinking and the approach towards Zimbabwe, and then to try and say what is more pragmatic I'm of the opinion that the United States has done well and should do well to continue to hold the line as one part of the approach, but at the same time try to look at what is the real politic, what is the more pragmatic approach towards actually achieving certain goals and building loose coalitions and alliances, and not doing it alone, trying to work cooperatively and in coalition with neighbors and member states and regional blocs towards inducing behavior change in Harare. Otherwise, without that being taken into account, the US policy seems more and more isolated, and the narrative that has been pushed has been mostly of hypocritical, anti-imperial, anti-Western, which seems to be getting more ground and gaining currency within the region. So that would be my kind of angle, and try to look at that. And as well as the role that the United States can play in the re-engagement efforts that are underway. At the same time, while it's holding the line, but also showing that there is some incentives towards engagements and incentives towards more cooperative and more cooperation towards a resolution of the 23-year-old crisis in Zimbabwe. That would be my submission. And I think as we discuss, we'll put in a bit of more evidence on how this has played out at the present moment and how this can be repurposed and reconfigured going forward. Thanks, James.
Thank you so much, Ringisai, and perfectly on time. We'll pass things off now to McDonald.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, James. And yeah, just thanks to the organizers. I think this is a very, high-level panel. I don't know how I find myself here, but I'm happy to be here and to share my thoughts on the topic. And I think, as the previous speaker just mentioned, this question that we're looking at of the Zimbabwean elections and their impact on US foreign policy needs to be looked at in its proper historical perspective. I think that a lot of us in the room will remember the days when Zimbabwe was listed as one of the outposts of tyranny, the days when Zidera was penned, the days when targeted measures and sanctions were put in place. And I think that when we talk about any kind of recalibration, any kind of change, any kind of shift in US policy where Zimbabwe is concerned, I think we need to locate it in that historical conversation, because it gives us the basis for comparison. If we are motivating for continuity, are we saying that nothing has changed over the course of the last 23 years? If we are motivating for some shift or change or recalibration, what exactly has changed that warrants that particular thinking to begin to emerge? And I think that I think that Ringisai has begun to touch on some of the big sort of like headline issues that we need to be having in terms of this conversation. But just for the avoidance of doubt, back then when Zimbabwe was listed as one of the outposts of tyranny and targeted measures were put in place, it was on account of the violent nature of the politics that was there on the ground. It was on account of repressive laws and pieces of legislation that led to limited media freedoms, shrinking civic space, and undermining of democratic process. I think that was the situation that was there. And as I said, what we then need to ask ourselves is whether there have been substantive improvements where this particular election is concerned in relation to these key issues of concern, in order for us to begin having a meaningful conversation. And I think that a case or analysis, just looking at the character, nature, and outcomes of this election in terms of its quality rather than its results, show that quite a number of issues that were of concern 20 years ago remain of concern at this particular point in time. Issues of violence have largely been reduced, and I think that is a good thing. But a peaceful election is supposed to be a normal thing. I think that the quality of elections and their credibility needs to be judged by more than the fact or reality that they are peaceful, because that is supposed to be the order of the day. But in a situation like Zimbabwe, I think it's worth pointing out and worth celebrating that there was relative peace or limited violence where these elections were concerned. But other issues like the repressive pieces of legislation remain with us today. One of the things that I was reflecting on as I came to this conversation was actually that these are the kinds of conversations that can actually get people arrested on account of what they call the Patriotic Act in Zimbabwe, which is a new law that came into existence in July as part of the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act, which is basically a law that seeks to gag people's ability to be able to engage freely and openly, especially with people who are offshore. So it's very easy. Someone can come and say, no, Michael, or Howard University or the Center for African Studies is an agent of the American government. And it makes it worse that Ambassador Ray is with us. Then they say, McDonald, you were engaging with foreign agents of a foreign government, saying bad things about the state and agitating for illegal regime change. But those kinds of laws are still in our midst. We have a law called, we have threats of a return of something called the Private Voluntary Organizations Amendment Bill, which has been on the terrain basically for the last 2 years. We can talk a bit more about that and prospects of its coming back under the new parliament. Media freedoms, a lot is still outstanding. And the issues of civic space and democratic process themselves are issues that were front and center in terms of the judgments where the election was concerned that were given by a variety of observer missions, not just the European Union, not just the Qatar Center, but SADC, and in some respects, the African Union and the Pan-African Parliament missions as well. So quite a bit has not changed there. But of course, in order for us to make sense of this conversation, I think that the only way we can be able to make sense of it in terms of what US policy in relation to this has to be determined by what we place value on. Now, the issue of pragmatism has already been placed on the table, and that approach basically suggests that things are what they are, and we need to embrace those and see how we can best be able to act perhaps strategically in respect of that. But there is another conversation that is to be had, and it's a conversation around principles and values, especially where the US is concerned and the immediate past history that has been there. I think that it's common cause that during the course of the last decade, there has been an autocratic turn that was emerging and which even us from a distance could identify where the US is concerned. The new administration or the Biden administration has tried to come back to the values around promoting democracy at home and abroad. And I think that that is something just from a principles perspective and an interest perspective that the US needs to take into consideration as we think about what kind of policy framework can be put in place. I see, James, you are back on camera. I'm taking that as a suggestion that my 4 minutes are up. But yeah, I mean, I'm just placing this on the table, happy to have more substantive conversation on this and other issues that I have noted down as the conversation progresses.
That was more a signal of interest than a subtle nudge, McDonald. I almost want to applaud that point, and I'll just say before we turn to Gilbert, I mean, that you raise a lot of really important issues that I don't think the United States has figured out in regards to countries it has treaty allies with, treaty alliances with, let alone a country like Zimbabwe. So Gilbert, I will turn to you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you the organizers for the invitation. Let me just say 2 broad points. One is that sanctions have remained a major irritant in US-Zimbabwe relations. And I think it's been put here clearly for the last 23 years. My reading is that I don't think the Mnangagwa regime, like the Mugabe regime before it, is interested in ending sanctions for 2 primary reasons. I think sanctions remain the major tool for domestic legitimation because there is no real other measure, there's no other source of legitimation. And that's why the sanctions remain a very critical tool in that process of regime domestic legitimation. But two, I believe that sanctions benefit the government because it has never made any efforts to address the basic issues in the sanctions regime, particularly issues of political reforms. And McDonald is talking about the autocratic turn. The autocratic turn has always been with us, I think, in the Zimbabwean context, since the sanctions were put in place. And I think the last election demonstrates very clearly that Zimbabwe has never moved an inch from the very autocratic and authoritarian turn that it began under the Mugabe regime. So I think that needs to be understood clearly, that there has been no incentive on the part of the government to make any minimum reforms that would justify the lifting of sanctions. And I argue, therefore, lifting of sanctions would in fact undercut the regime's own legitimacy, because it's also going to unleash the kind of domestic pressures that the regime is not interested in. So what is the point of lifting sanctions? Because you're going then to lift some sanctions. There has to be some promise of serious movement towards political reforms, particularly around the elections. And Nagaba government has blown that occasion, in fact, to demonstrate that it's going to be different from the Mugabe government. My second point is that there has been some shift in the region towards the Zimbabwe crisis, but this shift is not substantial. This shift is essentially very cosmetic. I think we saw that demonstrated in the SADC observer mission, where there was some language that was much more bolder than we've ever seen before. And observers are using that to say there is in fact a momentous shift in regional approach towards the Zimbabwe crisis. My reading of it actually hasn't been that important because if SADC had wanted to invest in a transparent and a clean election, it should have sent observer missions to Zimbabwe before these elections, which are described essentially as shambolic. So I'm not convinced that there is a substantive regional shift. But finally, on the regional shift, I think we saw South Africa, President Ramaphosa at the UN, at least making a point of sneaking a sentence in the speech that says that sanctions against Zimbabwe must be lifted because they hurt a common person. So that has been the language over the last 20 years, that the sanctions have to be lifted because they hurt the common people. So that may be true, but I'm just saying the demonstration on what needs to be done on the sanction front will need to come from the Zimbabwean authorities. And to me, there has not been any demonstration on that bigger issue. So we still remain at a stalemate, I think, at the US-Zimbabwe relation, but also the region still remains at a stalemate over what needs to be done. I think those are my opening remarks, Jim, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilbert, and very astute, I think. We're going to turn now to Ambassador Charlie Ray.
Thank you, Jim, and I really feel ill-equipped to comment after these great comments from the preceding speakers, but I think I would like to point out a couple of issues. One, I don't think anyone was surprised at the outcome of the election, and I would echo one of the previous speakers who said, while there was less violence, there were other issues that came to play that made, I think, the outcome foreordained. You know, in 2017, when the military removed Robert Mugabe in the non-coup, there was a window of opportunity, I felt, for both sides, both the U.S. side and the Zimbabwe side, to get some forward momentum on this whole issue of U.S.-Zimbabwe relations and the sanctions. And unfortunately, for various reasons, I think neither side took advantage of that brief window of opportunity. On the Zimbabwe side, what was needed, I think, in order to justify an easing of sanctions would have been sincere movement toward a free and fair electoral process and inclusivity, which clearly I think we saw in this most recent election is not there. I think, you know, the use of the legal system to impede and in fact almost destroy the any meaningful opposition, the quite questionable, in my view, administrative hiccups in provision of ballot. What I've heard recently are allegations of some post-election, even though limited violence, and I would point out a saying I remember being told when I was in Zimbabwe about violence. When you burned one village in that area, you no longer have to burn. All you have to do is shake a box of matches. And there was a lot of matchbox shaking, in my view, leading up to the election, and there's been some after. But the real key issue, and speaking of U.S. policy, just some comments there, and I will stop talking. This argument between principles and policy, or principles and pragmatism, I think misses a point. There is a way, in my view, that we could be, and I'm speaking now just on what I think the U.S. side should look at. We can be both pragmatic and principled at the same time. I agree with what Gilbert said. I think, you know, at this point, the government in Zimbabwe has done nothing that would justify the lifting of sanctions. And whether you are pro-sanction or anti-sanction, once they're in place, they take on a life of their own. But there is, I think, a way to be both pragmatic and principled, and that would be, you know, I stress the term targeted. These sanctions are targeted at individuals and individual entities. And one of the issues that always bothers me is the fact that we put sanctions in place, and then it's like we fire and forget. While the government writ large in Zimbabwe has done nothing to justify any movement, in general movement of sanctions, I think looking at individuals who are on the sanctions list and looking at individuals who are not on the sanctions list and then making adjustments starts to send a pragmatic but principled signal that we are trying to use these sanctions for what we said, and that is to change behavior. We might not be able to change the behavior of the whole government, but we can address the behavior of those individuals who are on the sanctions list. And I'm looking at events over the last 8 or 10 years since I left Zimbabwe at a number of individuals who haven't been put on the sanctions list who probably should. I think we could start to change the equation just a bit. Whether it will change it substantially remains to be seen, and it certainly won't happen overnight. But that would be, I think, a way to stand on our principles, but also act pragmatic at the same time. And with that, I will yield the rest of my time to other speakers.
Oh, thank you so much, Ambassador Ray. And I couldn't agree more that you know, the sanctions regime and you know, can always use tweaking, and it's a fire and forget, as you said. And in general, I'd be curious to see Michael address this, our next speaker. how these signals can be made more clear. What are the incentives, positive and negative, for this kind of reform, and what can the United States do to make that more clear to its partners, such as they exist in Zimbabwe. Go ahead.
So the United States, through the mission, published the Integrated Country Strategy back in 2022. And when you look at the U.S. mission strategy in Zimbabwe, it starts off with the goal of trying to improve accountability and achieving democratic governance that serves an engaged citizenry and respects fundamental human rights. We are well over 12 months since the ICS was published, and we have to evaluate where we're at right now. So when you look at U.S. foreign policy in Zimbabwe, and you look at the goals and objectives that the U.S. government has for engagement with Zimbabwe, there has not been a lot of progress made on the goals and objectives that were declared. And so that's a huge challenge. When you go through some of the other areas of the ICS, you get to the, Zimbabwe becoming a responsible member of the global community and a reliable partner for addressing these challenges that exist within the country, within the region, and around the world. When you look at these goals and objectives and you sit back and you say, where are we 12 months later, 18 months later? Where are we going in the next 18 months? With all of the developments that have happened, with the EU withdrawing its support, with the debate over the sanctions, with everything else that's happening in the Southern African region writ large, not just within U.S.-Zimbabwe relations, it is important. And I think that Ringisai made a very important point, that we're at an inflection point where we need to take a step back and really think about what is U.S. foreign policy with respect to Zimbabwe, and what is U.S. foreign policy in Southern Africa. When you look at the debate that's happening right now over the sanctions, I'm not really a person who is in a position to comment on what South African government or what the Zimbabwe government's position is on sanctions, except for to simply observe the fact that, there's a legitimate domestic political reason why South Africa is making the point to withdraw sanctions. There is an impact on South Africa of these sanctions. At least there's a perceived impact. But it's also a very big domestic political issue for Ramaphosa when you look at the upcoming elections. Migration is a big issue in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. And the Zimbabwe migration is part of that. And so, there's a domestic political, and I think the U.S. has to be realistic about that and understand where Ramaphosa is coming from when he's making those remarks. So when you look at the situation that we're in right now, and you look at where U.S. foreign policy is right now, I don't think we've made a lot of progress. We haven't made this kind of progress that was needed to be made in the run-up to the elections. And we seem not to be making a lot of progress right now in the aftermath of the elections. And so the question is, how do we make progress? To Jim's point, what are the signals that need to be sent? I think that the question is, where do we need to make that engagement happen? Is it with Zimbabwe? Is it with South Africa? Is it somewhere else? Is it the SADC level? Is it at the African Union? That's what strategy is all about, and having a strategy and figuring out where that strategy should happen. Is it really a bureau strategy? Is it an agency strategy? Is it the mission strategy? Is it beyond the State Department? Is it somewhere else in the U.S. government that needs to have that strategy to lead on engagement on this? And that's a big question. When you look at the comments that were made by the President of the United States at the United Nations, and a lot of the focus that's happening on engagement in Africa with the new corridor that's coming from Angola that's going to go across and bisect the continent, that's a huge economic investment by the U.S. A lot of things are happening in Africa, but Zimbabwe is rarely part of that conversation. And so that speaks volumes to sort of the prioritization of Zimbabwe in U.S. foreign policy. It hasn't really been a priority. And that gets probably to Ambassador Ray's comments about, putting sanctions in and then not really managing those sanctions after the fact, because it hasn't really been a huge priority for the United States. The question is, should it be a priority? And we're going to be talking about 3 debates later that I think are really important debates in the context of Zimbabwe. There's the debate over the elections, there's the debate over the sanctions, and then there's the debate over what role Zimbabwe is going to play in this new rush for the exploitation of minerals in Africa, which was part of the Nigerian president's remarks at the United Nations, and making sure that Africans benefit from all of this. And that isn't just a lunge at China. That's a lunge at everyone. It's a question of, how does the average person benefit from the tremendous mineral wealth that exists in Africa as we start to move to this, greater utilization of those minerals to propel the global economy forward. So I'll end with that. But, I think that, as we look to these debates we're going to be talking about in a second, it's just really important to take a step back and think, where is the U.S. today and where are we headed?
Thank you so much, Michael. And I want to thank all of our speakers for being appropriately brief and punctual with these opening remarks. I want to give us a chance to dive into exactly the debates that Michael kind of closed out with here. And I think many of the points have already been addressed by different speakers at one point to another, throughout the conversation so far. But I think it might be a good opportunity to take whoever would like to take up either the elections issue, the sanctions, or the issue of minerals and development, which is a major part of the future of Zimbabwe. As I understand it, they have the largest lithium mine in all of Africa, and that's going to become an increasingly more important mineral for powering electric cars and batteries of all sorts. Likewise, there's the question of sustainable development, which has been key to the conversations been happening around the UN the last week and a half, 2 weeks. The UN certainly seems to be at an inflection point where they're increasingly concerned about meeting the goals that they set for themselves about 5 or 10 years ago in terms of sustainable development. We know that there's tremendous equity issues when it comes to the implementation of sustainable development goals in Africa. So there's a lot on the table. And we could go just around one more time, or if there's someone that wants to jump on something right away, I'm happy to mix up the order. And I'll also just say before I see back the floor, if anyone wants to pop a question into the chat, please feel free to do so at any point. We would love to have some engagement with the audience here. If none of our panelists are going to jump in, if they've got something urgent they wanted to point out, maybe Ringisai, we can just go on back to you to see if there's anything you wanted to pick up from those major debates.
Thanks, James. I think there are a few things. The biggest challenge we have when looking at Zimbabwe-US relations vis-a-vis sanctions is what possibly what Ambassador Charles Ray said, that once sanctions have been put in place, they take a life of their own. But at the same time, we have to come back and say, what do we really want to achieve? Do we want a prolonged standoff? Is there in the history or in how these things turn out, at what point are we going to say, okay, we have sufficient ground to begin some conversation? I think with the way that things are turning out, firstly to say, for the longest time, the US is not clearly articulated in the public domain where this actually plays out, where the narratives build up and the optics are built, where alliances are formed and where heels are dug deep in. The United States has not been upfront in explaining its positions and clearly articulating what the sanctions entail, what the intention is, and what are the turning points, if there are any. What are the points of compromise, if any, besides the either this or nothing at all. That's the first thing. The second thing is to say, in 2013, when the sense and the feeling began to shift around from the Western countries, especially the EU and the United Kingdom, into 2017 and 2018, we get to a point where there is somewhat of an increased isolation of the US position on Zimbabwe. Not only from within Zimbabwe, but what can be perceived globally or maybe regionally. The third point is there is a perception of lack of coherence of what actually the values and principles are. So if you are sitting in Harare and you have been trying to study the US interaction with other African countries, which are actually, in terms of human rights abuse, in terms of property rights abuse, could be far off the line from where Zimbabwean is. And then you get into what I mentioned earlier on, the Zimbabwean exceptionalism, that there is to an extent where sentiments of an unfair treatment targeted towards Zimbabwe can begin to build up. And all that you are getting enough fertilizer for positions to harden, not for loosening of the soil. So we need at some point to have a gravitation towards discussion, to have a gravitation towards conversations. And I do agree with Michael that there could be, I'm not really privy to the whole gamut of the US machinery on international relations, but there is space within which the State Department's conversations at a government-to-government level or state level within the Zimbabwean functionaries could be aided either by the toning of rhetoric or some level of some shift in kind of perspective that there is some opening for conversation. Why I say this is, I think there's a desire for some impact or some effect or for some nudging of the needle towards some behavior that will change. And we need to do an analysis to say, the position that we have held for the last 23 years, has it really helped this behavior to change, or we seem to be stuck? And how else can we build a coalition? Because from my perspective is, without building a consensus within the African space, within the regional space, the US will increasingly find itself isolated on the Zimbabwean issue. And increased isolation on the Zimbabwean issue will only give Zimbabwe more fodder to fight against this. You need to remember that Zimbabwe is really dexterous as geopolitical diplomacy. This is the reason why we don't have the SADC tribunal at the moment. This is the reason why there's so much confusion as to what does the SADC actually do with the report. Because Zimbabwe is an expert at geopolitics at the regional level. They know the conversations, they know the buttons to switch. What we are trying to say is, can we get into a space where the US holds its line consistently and at the same time begin to say, but in this holding of the line, if there is a space of conversation, we might not be fully for it, but let it roll on. Let it get also a life of its own. And in this space, I'm speaking in terms of the Africa Development Bank-led process of debt relief and resolution, where they've come up with 3 pillars: the land reform, economic reforms, and governance. And I think this could be a likely space where we can actually begin to influence behavior. I do not think we are going to get a wholesome behavior change from the Harare administration. That is unlikely. But at what space, but we are provided with an opportunity to begin the conversation to say, okay, what is the give and take here? And I think this is really the conversations that we need to begin to look towards in terms of how do we actually get governance reforms working in Harare.
Thanks so much, Ringisai. And I think you really point out how, I should say there's a couple of questions in the chat that I want to encourage the other speakers to keep in mind in their remarks, and they're directly to do with, what we think, upcoming US policy actions should be or would be in Zimbabwe over the next couple of years. And, bring up again the question of what has sanctions achieved. And I think what you're speaking to, Ringisai, and I think our panelists have echoed this in various ways so far, is that in a lot of ways, the issues here, at least as far as U.S. foreign policy is concerned, are much more fundamental in terms of where things sit, how we understand the problems, whether the United States really is in a position to do the kind of coalition building, which, I mean, in my view, often precedes prioritization in a lot of ways. And perhaps one way to understand or have a clearer sense of how Zimbabwe policy is prioritized, in the State Department or elsewhere in the U.S. foreign policy matrix, is to understand where the coalitions are, where that kind of consolidation is. So, I think you raise a number of really important and fundamental points. So, I will, continuing, sort of with the order we've set up here, I'll pass it off to McDonald, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot again, James. I think that the conversation is not failing to excite me and inspire me. But I want to start my reflections by going back to my initial submission. That I think, okay, so let me start with the sanctions debate at the risk of engaging on it as someone who is in Zimbabwe and a Zimbabwean citizen. I think that as the sanctions debate is it blares a lot of issues, because you have that as if we are to take that as sort of like official US policy with regards to Zimbabwe, and the starting point would be that the war around rhetoric where the sanctions are concerned has been effectively won by the ruling party. And then this, I say this because as a practitioner, I know that we have not been able to engage on that subject, justify the existence of those sanctions for fear of being labeled as unpatriotic. And this is not something that is just emerging at this particular point in time. This is something that has eluded different generations of political and civic society leaders in terms of how to engage that particular subject is a political conversation to be had in Zimbabwe. I don't think that anyone is comfortable enough saying, yeah, put sanctions and so on and so forth, despite accusations that many different people have done so from the state. So at the level of rhetoric, narrative building and political engagement with the broad public, that debate has been lost to ZANU-PF. They've been adept at using it, weaponizing it, and instrumentalizing it to their advantage. And this is where I agree with Gilbert and others that at the end of the day, if something is working for you, why should it even be removed? Despite the calls from regional leaders like Ramaphosa, calls from the Zimbabwean government themselves. I think that it has served them well. On the inverse, it also then means that it has not served the other side of the equation fairly well. But it is something that is important in terms of its symbolic value, in terms of its actual impact. I see the comment around sanctions affecting ordinary people. I think that is part of the rhetoric. That is part of the rhetoric, and we need to be able to do a proper study and analysis to try to see how the ordinary person is being affected by targeted sanctions. But that is part of the rhetoric, part of the narrative that has been lost, and part of what ZANU-PF has been using to frame the political context in Zimbabwe. I think that sanctions have allowed them to frame the political context as an anti-imperialist battle of them against the US and Britain and so on and so forth. But there is symbolic value. I think that those who are pushing for change and thrive on solidarity would be happy to see that someone somewhere is doing something about it. So the example of the EU actions that were taken, that's not a lot of money that they've withdrawn, and they've withdrawn that amount of money post the elections. The effect itself is going to be limited, but it's got a lot of political and symbolic value. I just want to put that out there. Then come back to the policy question. You have policy as pronounced and policy as acted. I don't think that anyone who was watching the run-up to the elections in Zimbabwe would think that a very acrimonious relationship exists between the US and Zimbabwe on account of what ZANU-PF functionaries and spokespersons were actually saying in relation to their engagement with the US. So despite all these things that we have in place, it is clear that there is some level of engagement that has been taking place between the two parties. So this thing that you are asking for, Ringisai, is actually in existence. It may not be codified, it may not be overt, but it's clear that there is some engagement that has been taking place. Now, given that reality, if that was not enough to lead to fundamental changes in behavior and action, in addition to the overt and pronounced measures that the US government has been put in place, I doubt that something else might be able to do that. The challenge that we're faced with where Zimbabwe is concerned is that you've got a regime that is very dynamic and is made up of different colors, and which in the main it does not care about reputation. So reputational pressure, these kinds of measures, scandalizing them, does not necessarily work on them. So we need to think about what to do differently. And I'll then just quickly go through what I think needs to be done differently. I think that the approach where Zimbabwe is concerned needs to be informed by, we go back to the conversation of principles. US foreign policy where Africa is concerned must be clearly understood, it must be value-based, it must be principle-based. That way, you then run away from the kinds of challenges that Ringisai also placed on the table, where you've got a comparison saying, Zimbabwe is being targeted, but there are coups taking place in West Africa and stuff like that. I think that a foreign policy that is based on principles and values, and that calls a spade, before we get to these economic interests and issues and stuff, would save it a bit better in that respect. That's the first thing. The second thing is that instead of just focusing on punitive measures, we also need to begin to think about what it is that we can actually be able to do to positively to sponsor reform. And part of this is stuff that can be done in Zimbabwe, but part of it also relates to how the US is engaging with people who are with countries that are falling into the frame of democratizing, so to speak. So what happens to countries like Malawi? What happens to countries like Zambia? What happens to countries like Ghana, who have had clear democratic developmental trends, also matters and sends messages to people in other places. But in place, beyond focusing on punishing those who are intransigent, what are we doing with those that we perceive to be reformers and are pushing forward the reform agenda? In other words, I think given that we have a shared understanding that not much has changed where Zimbabwe is concerned, the question that we really must be asking ourselves is what can be done differently to encourage positive action? Because clearly punitive measures alone are not working. What is it that we can be able to do differently beyond punishing? How do we incentivize and strengthen, especially citizens' agency and people power? Because ultimately, that is where it's at. If at the end of the day, the US does not have a policy of intervening in domestic affairs and so on and so forth, it means that at the end of the day, it is left to the people on the ground to achieve the kind of change and reforms that they seek. What then can the US government and its policy do to strengthen that kind of agency and people-centered movement building and power in terms of the different instruments that are at its disposal at the end of the day? So I'm advocating for a reframing of the question so that we can be able to begin to come up with new answers to the problems that are clearly 2 decades old. Over.
Sorry. Thank you so much, McDonald. And you raised a number of, again, very, very important points. And you know, a lot of the discussion here is circling around, you know, the use of sticks and the seeming absence of carrots, especially when it comes to, you know, reforming and democratizing in a place like Zimbabwe. Gilbert, turning to you, can you shed any light on, you know, what effective carrots might look like in this situation?
You know, I think the EU, when it began to lift some of the sanctions earlier, was an incentive to the government in Zimbabwe to, in fact, begin opening up to what you'd call the broader West. And so I don't think we can separate the EU and the US in this respect. So I think it was an opening gesture that if there are reciprocal measures within Zimbabwe itself, especially on the governance, in the governance arena, there is no reason why the US should continue maintaining sanctions on Zimbabwe. To me, it's just a very straightforward story that sanctions were imposed at a moment when they were meant, in fact, to punish a regime that didn't seem to be reforming or addressing the governance issues. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that the government of Mnangagwa has been given opportunities. As I said, 2017, 2023, big opportunity to at least demonstrate that is moving from some of the old regime practices that led to sanctions. And I think that's why it ties the hands of those who are supposed to lift these sanctions, to say to them, what are we doing here? That there has never been any attempt to begin to move towards reforms that would address some of the basic issues in the functions regime. So I can understand Ringisai's point that, you know, maybe there was regimes across Africa, but that was not the original intent of sanctions. So I don't know how you bring that discussion of the comparative authoritarianism into the debate, because it muddies the consensus about, in fact, pressure from African civil society is that the US should be doing more in terms of democracy promotion, in terms of addressing egregious human rights violation by regimes, and the US should not be engaging these regimes. So if we go back to the old debates that no, you know, human rights don't really matter because sanctions are actually an irritant, and that we should now just go back to the argument we had that minerals are important here. The US should be caring about lithium in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has always been a big strategic player in minerals, all kinds of minerals, and everybody knows that. So the issue about revisiting old debates to me is what is really problematic. And how do you strengthen the hands of the reformers, the civil society actors who have suffered under these regimes? And now we just need to remove, I think the point, we just need to remove sanctions because they are not working. And ostensibly, they are not working for US interests. And I don't believe that's the argument I think Ringisai meant to make. Is simply that things may be bad elsewhere, but sanctions were targeted at a problem that has not been resolved. And so pulling back from that very argument will really, in fact, diminish the Biden administration's orientation towards a foreign policy that is anchored on some principle. And I think that's the dilemma. But the easier position is simply forget about sanctions. Zimbabwe is an important player. We don't care about human rights, and we can engage a regime that continually goes against the basic principles of a democratic regime. So those are my points, and I sympathize with the argument about there is a stalemate in the debates. But I'm saying we should understand why the debates have stalemate. The US continually engages Zimbabwean actors across the board. There is an embassy there. Our embassy has never been closed. There are avenues, therefore, for engagement. Zimbabwe has an embassy in Washington, and those avenues still remain as very critical in re-engaging a wide range of actors, if in fact there is a commitment on the part of the government to begin to re-engage the US? Jim, I should stop here for now.
Thank you, Gilbert. No, you raise such important points. I mean, something personally I've been frustrated with when it comes to the turns in the Biden administration's foreign policy has been that there has been this sort of broad reorientation around defending democracy, standing up for human rights, pinning foreign policy along these values, but this is primarily in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and these messages are focused primarily on Europe, and when it has come to policy in the Middle East or in Africa, these messages are much more muted. And this problem, insofar as we're talking about it in Zimbabwe, is not that much different than the kinds of positions the Biden administration has taken on Saudi Arabia or Iran, for that matter. Insofar as we see strategic interest there, and when there's strategic interest or a mineral or something in the ground that is useful to domestic politics, we're willing to. The administration is very willing to look the other way on human rights, on democratization, on reform. So turning to Ambassador Ray, this isn't a new problem. It's not a problem specific to Zimbabwe, but how can we start to square the circle a little bit more?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and I would say, first of all, I completely agree that we need to reframe the narrative, and I would start. I think I spent 3 years as ambassador to Zimbabwe, and I probably spent the bulk of my time arguing with people over sanctions. And the problem is this: we in the argument about sanctions and in the way that ZANU-PF frames their comments and their propaganda, if you will. I mean, they use the term sanctions and they drop the word targeted. And we don't, in our response or non-response to them, bring that up. And there is a difference between sanctions in general against a country, as we have with North Korea, as we have with some other regimes around the world, and targeted sanctions. And I don't remember the exact number, but I think in terms of Zimbabwe, it's some 200, less than 300 entities. And so in reframing the narrative, I would, my thoughts, and I'm no longer in government, so I'm only giving you my point of view, not what I think the U.S. government's point of view. I'm not privy to their deliberations. But one of the ways I think we could reframe the narrative is to take actions that put the focus back on the fact that these are specifically targeted sanctions. One of the issues, for example, the propaganda message from ZANU-PF is that these sanctions hurt the average Zimbabwean. Well, we need to analyze these sanctions, these targeted sanctions, and determine where sanctions against a specific entity do in fact create collateral damage for Zimbabweans who are not involved in the political process. And in there, for example, I would refer to the Agriculture Bank of Zimbabwe. A point that I held even when I was ambassador is that if we sanction a bank, we indirectly sanction all of its customers. So maybe looking at specific entities, and if we determine, for example, that sanctioning an entity like the Agricultural Bank actually does more harm to average Zimbabweans than it does in terms of putting a squeeze on some individual who we feel has been an impediment to democratization. And in this case, I think the sanctioning of the Agricultural Bank was because the majority of the people controlling it were part of the ruling elite who were involved in some of the anti-democratic actions. But if the sanctions on that entity were lifted, that starts to undercut the propaganda argument that you're hurting the Zimbabwean people, because then you are you are doing what I think targeted sanctions should be doing, and that is you are looking at the specific points of pressure to get your message across. Another thing that I think should be done is to look at the landscape in Zimbabwe as it exists now and look, are there people who are actively engaged in these violations of human rights, of limiting freedom of speech and so on, who are not on the sanctions list? If there are people, there were people in government, in the ZANU-PF when I was there, who were, I felt, were willing to sort of step back from their party's general actions and be cooperative in getting other things done, but they were on the sanctions list, and we couldn't, however you want to put it, take them off that list. By that inaction, we are giving legs to their propaganda. And I think if we, and I'm speaking now just as what can the US side do if we start to actually target these sanctions and take action as in real time in response to events on the ground, we can then reshape, I think, the narrative around sanctions for Zimbabwe. And one final point, I would echo what Gilbert said. We should have a policy that is based on principle. It should be, I think it should be pragmatic, but also based on principles. And I think some of the actions that we take, we don't really always adhere to that. Probably can't always adhere to that, but we just recognize that and move on. That in terms of Zimbabwe, though, I think we need to reframe the narrative and get the message back to these are targeted sanctions with we cannot change the government as a whole, but we are targeting individuals and individual entities to change their behavior, and the sanctions should respond to that change or lack of change.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Ray. Turning to Michael, I maybe give you an opportunity to pick up where the conversation has just left off. You know, I might ask, you know, how do we understand, we tend to understand transactionalism in foreign policy as a kind of negative thing. Like it's not the way we'd like to deal with true partners, in a quid pro quo transactional way when it comes to, deals on commerce in exchange for, cooperation on larger foreign policy issues. And it tends to be a way of doing things that pushes rights, reforms, humanitarian issues to the side. Does it have to be that way? And could it be different? Could transactionalism work in a more positive direction with a country like Zimbabwe?
There's a lot of opportunities for transactionalism right now. I mean, when you look across the border in Mozambique, with the situation with insurgency and terrorism that's existing in Mozambique right now, this gets back to one of the goals that's outlined in the ICS. Mozambique is, I think, higher than Egypt right now in terms of where it sits in the global terrorism index. It's higher than a lot of other places on the continent. Clearly, it's, I think, in the top 15 right now in the world. Mozambique is a big issue, and we can't ignore Mozambique. The United States government can't ignore Mozambique like it has ignored Zimbabwe for a very long time. Mozambique is an incredibly important country in the context of where the global war on terrorism is headed and has headed, and what impact it's going to have on the global economy. So I think there is a focus on Mozambique right now that is new, and that creates opportunities for transactionalism, because CT cooperation is something that the US desperately wants in Southern Africa. I think that's something South Africa desperately wants in South Africa as well. I mean, it destabilizes the region. It's not just a Mozambique issue. It's a Southern Africa issue. So there's an opportunity for transactionalism definitely on the CT side of the house. That's a risk for a lot of the things that we've been talking about on the human rights promotion and all these other things, because clearly if you get into the whole problem of trying to choose between security and values, or valuing security above all other values. But that is an issue, and there's a transactional opportunity there to engage the Zimbabwe government to try to promote CT cooperation, because there is a very long border between Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and that's an important issue. There's another transactional opportunity I talked about earlier with South Africa. I mean, Ramaphosa has made it a priority issue. I mean, it was something that was raised in the context of the UN conversations to call for an end for the sanctions. So there's an opportunity for a transaction right there for the US if it is serious about resetting relations with South Africa and it wants to help South Africa move forward on some of the priority issues for South Africa. In that discourse and in that narrative that's been created, regardless of whether, this is, normatively a debate that we want to get into, there's a perception there that these sanctions do harm ordinary Zimbabweans. And there's a bigger perception that they harm people outside of Zimbabwe as well, including South Africans. And so, there's an opportunity for transactionalism there as well. So there's a lot of opportunities here for transactionalism. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a whole nother sort of ball of wax, which we could get into over the course of a 10-day summit if we wanted to. But, there are a lot of opportunities for transactionalism. On the lithium conversation that we were having earlier in the conversations about lithium, I mean, clearly, you have a huge percentage of the world's demand could be met by Zimbabwe. Minerals are still a huge export of the economy. It's the biggest export of the economy. So there's an opportunity there. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is just a reality. And so there's a lot of opportunities for transactionalism. But then you get back to the whole question about, should the US policy in Zimbabwe be transactional, or should it be something more? And that's a whole nother question. And that's why we really do. I mean, when you look at our integrated country strategy for Zimbabwe, it's terrible. It is not a good strategy. It is not a strategy that gets us to an outcome that the US needs to achieve in the context of the country, in the context of the region, in the context of the world. We need to have a really good strategy for engagement in Zimbabwe that helps to achieve our strategic objectives, not only in the country, but also in the region and in the world. And the strategy that we have in place is just extremely bare bones. And it's not clear what it's going to achieve. It hasn't achieved much to date. So I think one of the things we need is to have an ambassador at the post and to have a rethink on the integrated country strategy and to move forward with a complete rethink of what we're doing in the country. And that rethink needs to take into consideration what we should be doing in the region and what we should be doing with our reset with South Africa, with our CT mission in Mozambique, with our new corridor that we're building across Africa. It needs to, Zimbabwe is a part of all those conversations. Zimbabwe isn't just some asterisk country that you can just deal with on its own. And that's how we've been dealing with it largely. Zimbabwe is actually an integral part of a lot of other conversations the US needs to have about our policy in the region and the world. And, I think it's about time that we sit down and have those conversations as a country and figure out where we want to go. Over.
Thanks so much, Michael. We have about 20 minutes left on our schedule for today. I again want to encourage folks in the audience to submit questions. We have plenty of time and space to address those. I think perhaps on this round, go ahead. Yeah, I was going to ask if any of our panelists had questions or comments for each other. So Ringisai, I'm going to just pass it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, James. Just to really, I resonate a lot with what Michael is saying, and this is based on a few things. You'll be surprised, James, how many people cannot separate the difference between the OFAC and the executive orders and ZIDERA. And in a context where there's been no articulation of what is what for 20 years, where there is a conflation of issues on what aspect is meant to deal with what. When you try to explain to a forum that actually Zimbabwe has not been stopped from borrowing because the matter has not arisen in the International Financial Corporation because it still has arrears, you know. So there is no sanction against Zimbabwe's borrowing that has been enacted or put into action because Zimbabwe still has arrears and then that it cannot actually borrow in the international market. And this conversation is lost. Now, when you lose out such key aspects of the components of the policy and they are not well articulated and engaged with, and the narrative is not built in sufficiently and communicated sufficiently, and you allow the weaponization of the policy, it then creates a space where you begin to look at Zimbabwe as an isolated case and does not really build on what could the potentials of actually building a coalition around it. I think my first point was to say Zimbabwe has to be seen as part of a regional policy towards SADC as a region and Africa as a continent. The isolation of it makes the policies ineffectual. But if it is understood in the broader matrix, one. The second thing is, if there is a clear assessment framework, one of the questions that I keep being asked to say is, are there any milestones along the way? Or is it an either-or regime? Are there any key milestones of achievement to say, okay, if we see this, these are good indicators for us, without us achieving an outright realization of what is written down and prescribed. If we see these efforts, little as they might be, these are clear indicators. And the conversations, especially in the region with regional governments, is we have not seen if there are any possibilities of compromise. We might not get it all to all, but where are the spaces of building on compromise and negotiating and having the conversation? I really like what the ambassador said to say, there is need to push back on the overall weaponization and clearly indicate where the sanctions have been targeted to and they have impact on the individuals and their suffering, and is research being done on that? And this is really the role of the civil society to say, are we building a body of evidence on what is happening on the ground? And with this body of evidence, are we able to articulate clearly on the various forms of sanctions against Zimbabwe, what each has done and what is the impact? And how can we have conversations internally and externally on these issues? I think that would be my submission for now.
Thank you so much, Ringisai. Charlie, go ahead.
Yeah, one other thing that I would like to add, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this when I was talking. One other issue where I think we could move the narrative, and this is one that I pushed to a degree, perhaps not as strongly as I should have when I served in Zimbabwe. But as you know, the SADC Peacekeeping Academy is located in Harare. And going to Michael's point about the issue in Mozambique of extremism, but also in terms of Africa-wide of SADC's participation in peacekeeping, well, actually globally, SADC's participation in UN peacekeeping missions. A limited, at least, form of support for the Peacekeeping Academy, I think, would also serve to sort of undermine ZANU-PF's weaponization of sanctions. As it is now, I don't know what it is presently, but when I was there, we could not do anything to support the SADC Peacekeeping Academy, one, because it was located in Zimbabwe, and two, because Zimbabwean military people would benefit from any training and support. And that's something I think we need to take another very close look at, because it would be without necessarily caving into or being too supportive of the larger Zimbabwean government would show that we are interested in the region and that we're trying to work to help the SADC region solve its problems.
Thanks, Charlie. Is it Michael? Go ahead. There you go.
Yeah, just to add on to what Ambassador Ray said, I think, this discourse that we have with the world and which our ambassadors have with the world, a lot of the discourse on Zimbabwe comes out of Zimbabwe. It comes out of people who are working on Zimbabwe. There's an opportunity for the U.S. ambassador in South Africa to have the conversation more often. There's an opportunity for the U.S. ambassador in Mozambique to have the conversation more often. There's a lot of opportunities for these conversations to be had. But to the point that Ringisai made, to the point that the ambassador made about, really coming up with a argument here for U.S. policy, to provide evidence for that argument, to be able to say that this is logical. What the U.S. is doing is a logical approach to achieving the goals and objectives that we have in Zimbabwe, in the region, and in the world. That's the argument that needs to be had. But when you look at, just the events, the discourse in DC, I mean, look at think tanks who cover Africa. How often do you see a Zimbabwe article in those think tanks? How often do you see conversations, like the one we're having today, webinars and events and things in Washington? You see a lot of things in London all the time. You see a lot of discussion on South African television. How often do you see it in the Beltway? I mean, how many people actually are engaged in Zimbabwe issues in Washington, D.C.? Not very many. So I think that you have to do two things. You have to make a compelling case and make a logical argument that U.S. foreign policy is rational and that we're actually moving towards the goals and objectives that we have set, and those goals and objectives make sense. And if we're talking about the sanctions, that the sanctions actually help to achieve that, you have to make that case. So that's the first thing. And then second thing is you actually have to elevate this on the policy platform. You have to make people care about this issue in the US. Now, you can make them care about it because you can put it in the context of our relations with South Africa. You put it in the context of counterterrorism. You can put it in the context of global competition with China. You can put a lot of boxes and make that much more relevant conversation. So you need to raise it on the policy platform as well. So I think you need to do those two things. And I think that would help to make this conversation a lot more effective in U.S. policymaking circles.
Thanks,
Jim,
Mike.
can I jump in here?
Please go ahead, Gilbert.
Ringisai and Mike were talking about a regional policy, and I don't really know what that means. I mean, there have been discussions within the SADC region on the Mozambique issue. That's why there is some emission there. What SADC doesn't want to do is have a debate on governance in Zimbabwe, because SADC doesn't talk about governance in member states, at least in an open forum. And there will be heavy divisions within SADC if SADC has to go that route. Why? Because SADC has experience in dealing with Zimbabwe issue from 2008 into 2013, when the Zimbabwe issue was a regionalized issue. And I don't think SADC has the stomach anymore to go into the debates that were led primarily by Thabo Mbeki in the 2008 period, Jacob Zuma into 2013. And Michael, if you look at the SADC debates about we need clean and transparent elections in Zimbabwe, and Mugabe would listen to them and tell them, you guys go back home and don't try to preach to me. So I don't know what the argument on a regional policy is going to look. What is defined as a regional policy on Zimbabwe is essentially a bilateral conversation between South Africa and Zimbabwe. And that has been a very consistent debate. The debate has been consistent on the line of a consensus that those sanctions should be removed. And that is why in 2023, Ramaphosa would make that statement at the UN. Therefore, it has been basically a bilateral discussion. And that discussion, there's no debate because they agree that sanctions must be removed. But if you ask Ramaphosa, what needs to be done in Zimbabwe to remove sanctions, again, you get the whole argument. We think that the Zimbabwean authorities are responsible enough to make the kinds of changes that are important for their country. So the content of our regional conversation, to me, I can't understand it. And therefore, by the very same logic, I don't know how the US comes to the region and begin to initiate a regional discussion on governance in Zimbabwe. There are other issues that the US is grappling with, even in bilateral relations between South Africa and the US. I don't know whether they would have time to begin now to pull the other SADC countries into conversations about this is what we now need to do. We need to reposition ourselves on Zimbabwe, and especially on the sanctions issue. I don't think it's a realistic debate. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just say something in response to that. So I think we're talking about two different things. So I'm talking about the Office of Southern African Affairs within the Bureau of African Affairs, the State Department. So I guess sub-regional level, but I'm talking about sort of on the US side of talking across the missions, not necessarily talking about SADC and engagement in a regional body. So, but yes, I your point is well made, and I think it's important to keep that into consideration.
Thanks, Michael, for that clarification. McDonald, I want to turn to you.
Okay, no, thanks a lot, James. And I do think that Michael is taking us in a direction that I think just from a policy perspective we need to be thinking about. This is a conversation around where the opportunities exist, and clearly, just in terms of US action itself, what is placing on the table definitely makes sense. In the same token around possible avenues of influence and where opportunities exist, there's something that was placed on the table by Ringisai earlier around the debt and arrears clearance program and the different subject matters that are supposed to be dealt with under that framework, land, governance, the economics and stuff like that. I think that an opportunity exists there. Part of the difficulty with identifying these kinds of opportunities is that sometimes, well, all the time, it takes two to tango. And a lot depends on whether there actually is interest around engagement or re-engagement or cooperation from the Zimbabwean government side. And the argument that that we have already placed on the table is that, in some respects, what we have seen is that this is a government that cares very little about its reputation on account of what it believes to be a strategic position that it occupies. Now, a conversation that we have not had during the course of this meeting, which we were hoping to have, was one around lithium and how we are lithium rich as a country, just from a deposits perspective, and what that means for Zimbabwe's position and the perception that it creates on the country around what it can do and how it can be able to leverage that particular position. I think that, perhaps in another conversation, we might need to just take that up a little bit more. But a lot depends on the appetite that the government of Zimbabwe itself has to reform and to engage. And at the moment, indications are that it is limited, which is why my advocacy was going beyond what we can do from a policy perspective where the state is concerned. The US interests, broadly speaking, are clear and as laid out in the CDCS and other policy instruments. how else can we be able to achieve them? And I think that there are a few suggestions that I have made around that. The other important thing that we need to think about is when we are talking about U.S. foreign policy and the audiences that the U.S. government perhaps needs to convince. We need to ask ourselves who those audiences are. And even though it would be good for the Zimbabwean public to be behind U.S. policy, the primary audience is definitely a domestic one. And I think that is where the conversation around whether be it tough measures or soft measures, recalibration, that is where it needs to be fairly resonant. We can have the debate here and we can speculate about impact and stuff like that. And it would be good if part of that is informed by the aspirations and interests of Zimbabweans themselves. But I think that it does not need to be a primary audience. There was a time during Ambassador Thomas's days, if I'm not mistaken, when the US embassy actually went toe-to-toe, just in terms of the public debate and engagement on sanctions with the Herald and several government spokespersons. I don't think that is something that is sustainable. They did it, and I think it was a good thing. They were clarifying the different positions. But there is a limit to which an embassy can be able to engage in that toe-to-toe kind of engagement with a host government. So even though we want the position to be clarified, strengthened, and the narrative to be decent, I think that we need to be clear that the audience just might not, the primary audience might not need or does not need to be a Zimbabwean a Zimbabwean audience per se. Then lastly, just back to the debt and arrears clearance conversation, I think that as we think about U.S. foreign policy on Zimbabwe, it is important for us to think about what kind of links and leverage that the U.S. might be able to exercise where Zimbabwe is concerned. And as I mentioned, I think that is one platform. It is bringing multiple stakeholders. It allows the U.S. to insist on certain governance reforms, certain economic reforms, certain addressing of particular questions with regards to the land reform, but not doing so in unison. It is doing so in community with other people who are owed something by the government of Zimbabwe. I think that there may be opportunities there. And those opportunities exist, not because the government of Zimbabwe is willing, but is willing to engage on them, but because there is leverage that exists, and that leverage is in the form of the external debt that the country owes. So we need to look for other opportunities like that in order to have an impact. It's not going to be just about willingness and the goodness of the state's heart, if it has one.
Thank you so much, McDonald. So we are just about at time here. So I really want to extend our thanks, my thanks to Anya and Krista Johnson, the director for the Center of African Studies at Howard, for hosting us today. I want to thank each of our panelists, Ringisai, McDonald, Gilbert, Charlie, and Michael, for joining us in a really vibrant conversation. And I hope it's one that we can continue both in this forum, at forums at FPRI, or on our website and other places in the not too distant future. Thank you all for coming, and I hope we'll see you again soon.